back, everyone. Now, the House and Senate are looking to pass a new infrastructure bill, and one of the big concerns with this is that inside that bill are some of the provisions in the Green New Deal, much of which is being pushed as well. Now, here to talk with us about this and what it really means is Hayden Ludwig. He's an investigative researcher with the Capital Research Center. Hayden, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thanks for having me on.
So I guess first off, there's this new infrastructure bill. A lot of concerns, again, that it contains parts of the Green New Deal. Is this just a wild concern, or is this a valid concern?
Well, if we're talking about the Green New Deal, people should be concerned because we're talking about the most radical environmental policies ever proposed, possibly anywhere, but certainly in the United States.
Now, if we go back to the Green New Deal, a lot of people just laughed at it at first. Most of the conservative coverage on it was just more making fun of it, things like farting cows and so on. It didn't go much further than that. But different politicians, including Pelosi herself, are still pushing this. What was actually in the Green New Deal that you say is concerning?
Well, I would say first that it didn't not go anywhere. It actually went all the way to the Oval Office. I mean, you can find provisions of the Green New Deal bill that were in President Biden's campaign platform. Things like jailing dissidents who question quote unquote climate science or rather the climate consensus, but also even things like that sound more innocuous, like achieving 100% renewable energy by 2035, which is simply an ideological statement. It's actually a climate impossibility, an engineering impossibility to actually restructure the entire electrical grid to produce no carbon dioxide. But this is something the radical left has been trumpeting for years, and it's finally made its way into the White House.
So you're saying that basically parts of the Green New Deal have been kind of split up and put into different provisions. Is this accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. The way I look at it is the environmental left for years has been about the fringiest, most extreme edge of the entire Democratic Party. And they've been making their extreme statements mainstream among Democratic Party politicians. And we've seen even Joe Biden, who is hailed by the media as this moderate in so many ways, has already proven himself the most extreme president we've ever had when it comes to environmental and energy policies. So, in fact, even if the Green New Deal itself hasn't been passed into law, it's certainly embedded itself in the mindset of your average Democratic Party politician and left-wing activist. I think there's simply no power on the left right now that opposes something like the Green New Deal from passing.
Now, you mentioned one of the provisions that Biden himself mentioned was the possibility of imprisoning people for questioning the science on climate change. A lot of people would say that sounds a bit far out. What would you tell them?
Well, it was a campaign promise on JoeBidenForAmerica.com. I mean, if you look at it, that was part of his energy platform, was making environmental justice. That's a phrase coined by far left activists, making that part and parcel of every department, every bureau, and every agency in the Biden administration. And to my knowledge, he's doing that right now. Now, whether they're going to start sending the FBI out to go prosecute CEOs of oil companies is beyond me. But the fact that a man like that would run on such a platform of jailing people for quote unquote polluting the environment, and even saying things like bringing to bear the fullest extent of the law using the Department of Justice, that should terrify anybody, because what they're saying is if you disagree with us on something that is hardly settled science and has the most far-reaching consequences for the future of the United States and our economy, if you disagree with us on that, we're going to pursue you with a weaponized Department of Justice. That's a terrifying thing. It's the kind of thing totalitarian governments used to do.
Now, you mentioned that one of the things they want to do is remake the entire electric grid so it's zero carbon emissions. You said that's impossible. And a lot of people would say, well, what about renewables? What about, for example, windmills and so on? What would you tell them?
Well, I don't think a lot of people understand how the electrical grid works. It's not like a light bulb dimmer, where if you just give it a little less power, you just get a little less result. It's much more like a computer or a television. If you don't provide exactly the minimum amount of electricity to the grid that's required at all times, it simply shuts off. It doesn't perform inefficiently, it turns off. So the problem with this is that wind power and solar power are notoriously unreliable. In fact, we should call them unreliables, not renewables, because they're intermittent. There's simply times of the day when the sun doesn't shine. There's times of the day when the wind gusts and other times where it's absolutely still. So what happens when the wind turbines stop turning and the sun stops shining? Well, they stop producing electricity. And if you don't have that minimum energy input going into the grid, when people need to draw upon it, the grid will shut down. And good luck turning it back on again. That's not a simple process. So it's a lie to say we can replace steady, reliable forms of energy, even including nuclear, by the way, but also talking about coal or oil or specifically natural gas, that's a very common one, with renewables like wind and solar, because no serious engineer, no serious politician would ever actually propose really replacing these reliable forms of energy with things that are going to cause catastrophe in your economy.
Now, I know a lot of people would say, well, what about storing the energy? What about having battery systems that can store it? Is this possible?
Well, it's science fiction, is really what it is. We do have lithium battery technology, but if you look at, for instance, Tesla's Gigafactory in Nevada right now, right? It's a massive factory. That's the most advanced in the world, and yet there's no way it could supply power on a scale that even a city could run on for a day or two. The technology simply isn't there. Now, people would say, well, that's why we need to subsidize these technologies. We've been subsidizing lithium battery technology and all sorts of renewable technologies like wind turbines, solar panels for decades. The federal government spends tens of billions of taxpayer dollars just to make those forms competitive with things like gas and coal, and they're still not competitive. So one wonders, at what point do we stop subsidizing something that can't pay for itself? Well, if you look down the road, we don't see any brand new technology coming through there. In fact, from my understanding is that engineers have already calculated what the realistic maximum efficiency for a wind turbine or a solar panel is, or even a lithium battery to store that energy. And we're already about there. So we would need some kind of quantum breakthrough with this technology that simply hasn't come to pass and simply doesn't appear to come to pass before they're even reliable enough to consider replacing more traditional energy sources.
Now, we saw recently in Texas where the wind turbines froze over, and we've actually seen similar incidents happen in Germany. And this is bringing into question whether it was local issues that caused this. Was it a cyber attack? There's all kinds of speculation over what might have caused it. What really happened with this, and what does this show us?
Well, my understanding is that it was really a perfect storm of events, right? So, first of all, we had a massive cold front come down that affected north and western Texas. The problem with this is that it has nothing to do with climate change. Weather and climate are two related but totally different concepts. But changing climate, whether it's getting hotter or colder, has no bearing, despite what the left-wing media says, no bearing on day-to-day weather. And freak weather, extreme weather, like what we saw in February, does happen, and it happens everywhere from time to time if you give it long enough. So Texas is a state that's extremely well prepared for hot weather, but its buildings are not prepared for extremely cold weather, like say a place like North Dakota would be. So for one thing, you had cold weather front that comes in and sits over parts of the state that are highly dependent upon renewables. Now, renewables didn't cause that weather. They didn't cause the crisis that the cold weather did, but they massively exacerbated it. Because there was very little wind and it was icy cold, most of those wind turbines stopped moving and they froze over. So in an instant, half of Texas's fleet of wind turbines stopped producing power. Well, the dirty secret about so-called renewables is because they're so unreliable, you have to back them up everywhere with something that is reliable, in this case, natural gas. So natural gas is the number one energy source to Texas's electrical grid. Wind is number two. When you lose number two, you got to go all the way to natural gas. So natural gas pumps kicked on immediately to make up for the loss in electricity. Problem was, it was so cold, many of those pumps froze solid. And because natural gas is a little different from coal, you can store a lot of coal for periods of time, making it really good for emergencies. The natural gas is usually direct use, which means you pump it out of the ground and you burn it right away. Well, if you can't pump it, you can't burn it. So what we saw is, as people were drawing more and more upon the grid, it was spiking in electricity use. But electricity input from places like the pumps, right, or wind turbines was stable or even dropped. So that resulted in rolling blackouts across the state to keep it from overloading the electrical grid. So would that have happened if the state wasn't massively getting over reliant on wind turbines. Yeah, I think it could have happened. You still would have had extreme weather. But having an increasing reliance on federally subsidized wind turbines for the sake of getting those federal subsidies and calling yourself green, it exacerbated this problem that kept millions of people without electricity, even freezing to death in some cases for weeks. It was an absolute disaster brought on by green policies.
Now, the solution the Biden administration proposed was having the federal government take over some of the Texas electrical grid. I know Texas was pushing back against that. What were they actually trying to do with this, the federal government taking over the electrical grid?
Well, I think there's a serious consequence if they do that, and that's that you're going to see an easier pipeline for more environmentalist policies to come through. I mean, we can see in my state of Virginia right now, for instance, the legislature, which is a Democratic legislature, has passed renewable mandates that require X percentage of Virginia's power to come from wind and solar. If you allow the federal government to come in and start dictating terms in a state like Texas, you're going to see them bypass what the legislature has to say about these renewable mandates, and you're going to see an over-reliance on wind and solar. Now, that might work for a little while. That might seem okay, although you're likely to see ratepayers' bills go up. But when the next time an extreme heat wave comes in and people use their air conditioning, will these things be there to help you? Next time there's an extreme cold front that comes in and the wind turbines stop turning and the solar panels shut off and everything freezes over, will you have the ability to make up for that loss in energy? It's really doubling the amount of energy that you need to replace half the amount of energy. And that's the problem with these things. You want to replace 20 megawatts of, let's say, a coal burning power plant with 20 megawatts worth of wind turbines. You're actually building an additional 20 megawatts worth of, say, natural gas to make up for that 20. So that's highly resource inefficient when you think about it. It's not economical at all because it's being pursued in an ideological line. It's to be politically correct, not to properly use resources.
On the note of the politically correct angle, I was looking at some of the statements you mentioned in your article from Nancy Pelosi, and when she's talking about pushing the Green New Deal, in that same statement, she's mentioning fighting against inequality and fighting against racism and fighting against what she calls essentially neo-Nazis. How does this relate to the environment? How do these things tie together?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, that's the simple answer is white supremacy and neo-fascism have nothing to do with the environment. But that's kind of the point. The Green New Deal, I would say, has nothing to do with climate change. It has nothing to do with global warming, the environment, period. It's everything to do with remaking the entire United States in the radical left's own image. I mean, if you read the text of that bill from a few years ago, you'll find references, fig leaves to global warming that immediately jump into things they really want to talk about. And that's about combating rising income inequality and environmental justice, which really is a way to say reparations to Black and brown communities because they've been systematically oppressed by white communities. And this has nothing to do with the environment. What it really is it's the culmination of critical race theory taught in universities that we see all over the radical left, coming together with global warming theory from decades ago. And why this is so dangerous is that it allows the federal government and the activists who are running the ship right now, it allows them to justify changing anything they want. I mean, they can say where you live, how you travel, what you eat, even how many kids you have. That's what China did. That was China's one-child policy was an environmental measure, not a social measure. They can justify all these things in order to save the United States and the world from a climate apocalypse. That's why this is so dangerous. It's an open-ended mandate for the most radical transformation we've ever seen proposed. And that they call it the Green New Deal. And I would even point out the author of the Green New Deal, a gentleman named Saikat Chakravarty, who was formerly Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff. He told the Washington Post in 2019, you guys think of this as a climate change thing? We think of the Green New Deal as a how do you change the economy thing. I take his word for it. I think that guy knows what he's talking about, and he's letting slip the truth about this measure.
And so you're saying this is the environmental narrative is more like the Trojan horse for these other policies, this other agenda. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, if you had somebody proposing Soviet-style socialism in the United States, I can't imagine how it would look much different from what the Green New Deal has to say about it. And even if that specific bill doesn't come to pass, even if it shows up in pieces, it's a tip to what the left really wants to do, which is to totally transform this country from top to bottom. I mean, there's a reason, I think, and this is my theory, why the Democratic Party is pushing so much radical environmental policy right now as opposed to anything else, like Medicare for all, for instance. And my theory is that they realize that this is the fastest way to get the amount of power that they want over people's lives. And it's easy to sell. If you can sell somebody on, if you don't let me pass this measure, you die, right? The whole world goes up in smoke, so to speak. If you can pass that, you can justify whatever you want. And I think if you look at traditional socialism, like the kind we see in China, for instance, it gives the government power over everything you do. I mean, everywhere you live. Environmentalism is the only ideology I know of that goes even more beyond that. It gives the government power over your very genes, over what you get to breathe out. I mean, the cellular level kind of control that makes people dream they're little gods or something. And this is why it's so dangerous. I mean, it's the most extreme thing we've ever seen.
You mentioned this ties to critical theory. I guess, first off, could you explain critical theory to us, and how does this relate to critical theory?
Sure. Many people have heard the term intersectionality. This comes out over the last few decades. This has come out of left-wing universities. And it's a way of basically describing in Marxist terms all human history. I say Marxist because it's influenced by Marxism, even if it's a thing unto its own. So you got to understand that all Marxists basically see the world in terms of one oppressor class oppressing an oppressed class. And that used to be the capitalist class oppressing the proletariat, the labor class. Well, that didn't really work out. We see the Soviet Union's collapse as proof of this. Well, you fast forward to 2021, you have the same kind of dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed applied to things like white people and black people or non-white people, right? And this is the idea of you have oppressing races or even oppressing sexes. You have men oppressing women. And intersectionality is a way to describe varying degrees of quote unquote oppression. So if you're a homosexual male, a black male, for instance, you've got more degrees of oppression against you than if you were let's say a straight black male, right? This is why we get into these kinds of oppression Olympics where they're counting up the number of so-called grievances against them. Well, this is critical race theory. It's basically a way to describe all human history as one series of oppression after the next. And if your listeners have heard of the 1619 Project, it's the effort to remake American history and say it's all based on race oppression and class warfare, that sort of thing. That's just the education component to what we're talking about. So right now we're seeing the left apply this critical theory idea to everything across the board. I mentioned environmental justice. That's just the name for critical theory applied to global warming. And it's this idea of you have rich polluters, right? Those are people who own houses, people who own multiple cars, who are, by the nature of their pollution, oppressing the oppressed people. And these are poor people who live in poor communities, who are ethnic minorities. So you can see how they can justify just about any sort of sweeping redistribution or reparations agenda by pointing out it's all climate related.
I remember when the Green New Deal was first passed, one of the founders of Greenpeace actually came out and criticized it, saying that it would kill a huge portion of the United States, arguing that basically by remaking all the infrastructure, you'd have people freeze to death, you have people starve to death. And Wikipedia actually, if I remember right, deleted him. They erased him, like Stalin style, just erased his history. And that was a real concern he raised, though. I'm curious if you're familiar with that individual, what he said, and what the nature of that warning was.
Yeah, I am familiar with him. And it should be pointed out, he's not a conservative. He's actually a kind of an old school liberal, actually. So he takes environmentalism very seriously. He's not an apologist for so-called climate denial or something like that, or a front for big oil or something crazy like that. So I take what he has to say very seriously. It's the irony of the most sweeping environmental bills that are supposed to save us from climate change would actually totally deforest the United States. If you've ever taken a drive out to places like rural Maryland or parts of Texas or California, you'll see huge chunks of land taken up by wind turbines and solar panel arrays. They're very land inefficient. I mean, the same amount of energy could be produced by a tiny gas-fired power plant, right? So the amount of land they take up to produce an equal amount of one of these power plants, traditional power plants, is enormous. Well, if you try to power, let's just say, an entire state on that, and there are proposals to power, say, Virginia on that, and I'm not exaggerating when I say you would have to effectively deforest the entire state, carpet it with solar panels and wind turbines just to provide an equal amount of power. And that says nothing to the inefficiency of that. It says nothing to the unreliability of these things. When they shut down, how do you power yourself? So we go back to Texas for an instance. If Texas tried to run itself entirely on wind turbines and solar panels, next time there's a major crisis like a cold front moving through, it wouldn't have backup power. As many Texans as lost power, at least some of them still had backup power from burning coal or things like that. If it was all renewables, there would be no backup. That's the very point of things like the Green New Deal, is to replace them. So really, when they were proposing saving the planet, they were actually proposing killing the planet by totally deforesting it. There's also the point, too, of what it takes to build these things. I mean, building just the foundation for a single wind turbine is hundreds of tons of concrete embedded very deep into the earth just to support these things. It's tons of steel. It's tons of copper wiring. And these things only last for around a decade before they have to be replaced. And they're not very good at recycling a lot of these components. You can replace things like the copper wiring, but lithium batteries, which are part and parcel to running all these things and storing their electricity, most of those pieces cannot be replaced. So we're filling massive dumps full of lithium batteries and things that are supposed to be saving the planet. In reality, they're polluting the planet with all sorts of excess materials, resources that could have been better used elsewhere.
Now, I know many politicians kind of see this as an apocalyptic kind of vision, and they're, basically justifying extreme measures to bypass what they view as this apocalyptic situation, or at least that's the narrative they're pushing. Um, I guess what would you tell folks who have this viewpoint? I know in school, kids are being told this as well. The world's going to end unless we do something drastic. This is the mentality of a lot of them.
Well, I would say we need to start teaching our kids to question the things that they're taught. Ask if there's an agenda, if somebody stands to gain, and that's why they're asking you these questions. And no matter who it is, by the way, you should always do that. I think it's how you get to the truth of people's claims. But I would point out, too, so much of what I see in the environmental left is built on a single lie. It's like an upside down pyramid, if you think about it. A normal pyramid has a large base. But if you flip it upside down, a huge base is resting on a single little point. And that point in this case is the lie that carbon dioxide is this kind of pollutant that's destroying the planet. It's not. That's a lie. Carbon dioxide, we're all taught in school, is the thing that plants eat in order to pump out oxygen that we all breathe. Carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring substance. If we didn't have it, this would be a dead planet. No doubt about that. Even environmental activists have to admit that. So it's a silly idea that we're polluting the planet, we're destroying it by pumping things out. And I would say look beyond what the stuff that environmental activists and so-called scientists, many of whom are not scientists, they're activists. Look beyond these things and look at what things like what NASA is putting out. NASA has actually published images of what they call the greening of the Earth. And they've shown since about the 1980s, satellite imagery shows that the Earth is vastly more green because it's more forested. And that's at the same time that carbon dioxide levels have been going up. Well, that's not surprising. If you look at places like greenhouses pump in tons of carbon dioxide in order to get plants stimulated to grow rapidly. Those aren't dangerous. People can walk in there and breathe the air just fine. They're not going to die just because CO2 is being pumped into the atmosphere. People need to be clear on that. The other thing, too, is ask whether these activists are telling you the truth. One of the greatest fables, I think, in our society is this story about a band of underfunded and plucky environmental activists in places like Greenpeace and the Sierra Club who are facing down this Goliath of big oil and gas who are trying to spin lies while these people are heroically trying to tell the truth. In reality, what I found is actually they're usually on the same side. Big oil and gas know that every time you install renewables, they get a guaranteed customer because you have to back all that up with some form of fossil fuel. So usually big oil and gas, not little companies, but like ExxonMobil and Chevron, these are some of the biggest lobbyists for federal subsidies of renewables. So they're usually on the same side as this issue as far left activists. And they both are aligned against the person who pays the rates, who pays the taxes to fund all these subsidies. So question these narratives that we've been brought up with and ask yourself, do they even stand up to reason? One more thing I would leave you with is that science is not about consensus. If you bring a bunch of people together and say we all agree on the same thing, that doesn't necessarily make it true. What makes it true is if you follow the scientific method and find out what's an actual fact, not what do people feel strongly about. People pushing consensus are not pushing science. They may be pushing a lie, but they're certainly not pushing science. And we need to teach our kids what the scientific method includes. And that's always questioning things, always assuming that everybody's agreed on the same thing doesn't make it true. We need to get to the bottom of these things.
Now, I guess just last question here. You talked about environmental justice. You talked about the deeper motive behind it. I think a lot of people in the grassroots genuinely believe that they're fighting for something good. You're suggesting there's a broader agenda though behind this, tied to this environmental justice idea. What is this broader agenda?
Well, I would say if you follow it to its natural conclusion, true environmentalism leads to population control. And I know that's a strong statement, but I stand by it. And the reason is I traced the origins of environmentalism back to the eugenics movement and the pro-abortion movement, in short, the population control movement of the 20th century. If you go back to, let's just say, the 1920s, you can find what we would see as basically the first disorganized environmentalists. If you go to the 1930s, you find that the first government that I know of to proclaim environmentalist policies was actually Nazi Germany. I'm not saying environmentalists are Nazis, but if you go back, you can find 1930s articles from the state propaganda arms bragging about their wind power that they're going to have, and they're going to save the fatherland through wind power. And if they had solar panels, I'm sure they'd be bragging about that too. If you follow that all the way to the present, what you see is honest environmentalists who will tell you, and I look at a guy like Michael Moore, who in his recent documentary, Planet of the Humans, pointed this out. If you really are serious about stopping climate change, you want to save the planet because you believe in those things, then renewables are not going to save it. And if you're opposed to something like nuclear power, which is very reliable, very safe, it's very cost-effective power, and it produces no carbon dioxide, if you bar yourself from using that, as many people on the left have for their own reasons, then what you're left with is minimizing the number of humans left on the planet. There's no other way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions short of massive population control schemes. And if you go back to the 1960s, you'll see people proposing that. There's still organizations around that propose these things too, by the way. There's an organization that came out in the 1960s called Zero Population Growth. It's now called, I think it's now called Population Council, Population Connection, excuse me. But Population Council is another organization. These were founded by people who believe there are too many humans back in the 1960s, when we've probably doubled our population since then. So we have to be wary of these things because they will ultimately end in controlling how many children you can have, how many children can exist in third world countries. So it's little wonder to me when I look at some of the people who are pushing population control 45 years ago, 50 years ago, and now they're some of the loudest proponents of abortion overseas, of loosening abortion laws in the third world, in Africa and poor parts of Asia. They see a strong connection between the two clearly, otherwise they wouldn't support these things. We should too.
Hey, Hayden Ludwig, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.